I used to think I knew what heartbreak felt like. I thought I understood pain when my marriage fell apart, when I lost my job, when my father passed away after his long battle with cancer. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the moment I lost my son. His name was Daniel, and he was everything good in this world, wrapped up in 23 years of pure light. People always said he had my stubborn streak and his mother's gentle heart. But the truth is, Daniel was something entirely his own. Even as a little boy, he had this way of seeing the world that made everyone around him feel like they were looking at life through a cleaner window. I remember the day he was born, how the nurse placed him in my arms, and he stopped crying the moment he heard my voice. Sarah, my ex-wife, used to joke that Daniel and I were cut from the same cloth, but I always knew he was made of something finer than me. Where I saw problems, he saw solutions. Where I saw endings, he saw beginnings. Where I built walls, he built bridges. The last conversation we had was on a Tuesday evening in March. He'd called me from his apartment downtown, excited about a project he was working on at the non-profit where he'd been volunteering. Daniel had graduated with a degree in engineering, but instead of chasing the corporate ladder like I'd done, he'd chosen to work with an organization that brought clean water to underserved communities. I remember rolling my eyes at his salary, or lack thereof, but now I'd give anything to hear him talk about flow rates and filtration systems with that infectious enthusiasm of his. "Dad, you won't believe what happened today," he'd said, his voice crackling through the phone with barely contained excitement. "We got approval for the Guatemala project. 6 months from now, 3 villages are going to have access to clean water for the first time in decades." I was sitting in my home office, staring at spreadsheets, half listening while I worked. God, how I wish I could take back that distraction, that divided attention. "That's great, son," I'd said, not looking up from my computer screen. "Listen, can we talk later? I've got this presentation tomorrow and—" "Sure, Dad. No problem." His voice had dimmed just a little, but typical Daniel. He didn't push. "I love you. Love you too, kiddo." Those were the last words I ever said to my boy. 3 days later, a drunk driver ran a red light and took him from me in an instant. The phone call came at 2:17 in the morning. I know because I stared at that green digital display on my alarm clock for what felt like hours afterward, watching the numbers change while a police officer's words echoed in my head like a broken record. "Sir, I'm sorry to inform you that your son, Daniel Patterson, has been involved in a fatal traffic accident." Fatal. Such a clinical word for something so devastating, so final, so utterly wrong. The weeks that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, and a parade of well-meaning people who said things like, "He's in a better place, and everything happens for a reason." I wanted to scream at them, to shake them, and ask what possible reason could justify taking a young man who was literally saving lives, who had so much more to give to this world. But instead I just nodded and thanked them for coming, playing the part of the grieving father who was somehow holding it together. The truth was, I wasn't holding anything together. I was falling apart in ways I didn't even know were possible. Some days I forgot to eat. Other days I ate everything in sight, trying to fill a void that food couldn't touch. I stopped shaving, stopped answering my phone, stopped caring about the presentation that had seemed so important that Tuesday night. Sarah tried to help, despite everything that had gone wrong between us. She'd bring groceries and sit with me in Daniel's old room, both of us surrounded by the artifacts of a life cut short. His college textbook still bookmarked with sticky notes, covered in his careful handwriting. The guitar he'd learned to play in high school, leaning against the wall with one string broken. The photos covering his bulletin board. Friends, family, places he'd traveled, people he'd helped. "We have to clean this out eventually," Sarah said one afternoon, her voice gentle but practical. She was always the practical one, even in grief. "No." The word came out harder than I intended. "Not yet." She didn't push, just squeezed my shoulder and left me alone with my son's ghost. Work became impossible. I'd sit at my desk and stare at emails about quarterly reports and budget projections, and none of it mattered. How do you care about profit margins when your child is dead? How do you motivate a sales team when you can barely motivate yourself to get out of bed? Eventually, my boss suggested I take extended leave. "Take all the time you need," he said, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He was worried I might never come back. He wasn't wrong to worry. The drinking started slowly, just a beer with dinner to help me sleep. Then it became 2 beers, then 3, then whiskey instead of beer, then whiskey instead of dinner. Sarah found me passed out on Daniel's bedroom floor, one evening, clutching one of his old t-shirts. I don't remember what she said to me that night, but I remember the look in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had the day she told me she wanted a divorce. Disappointment mixed with something that might have been pity. Months passed. Spring turned to summer. Summer faded to fall. The world kept spinning. People kept living their lives. But I felt suspended in that moment when the phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. I existed in a space between Daniel's last laugh and the officer's solemn voice, caught in a loop of if-onlys and what-ifs that played endlessly in my head. If only I'd paid attention during that last phone call. If only I'd told him I was proud of him. If only I'd insisted he stay home that night instead of going to meet friends. If only, if only, if only. The nonprofit where Daniel had worked sent me a box of his personal belongings from his desk. I let it sit unopened in my living room for weeks. Another monument to my cowardice. Every time I looked at it, I felt like I was drowning all over again. Inside that box were the final pieces of my son's daily life, the last things he'd touched, the final evidence of dreams he'd never get to fulfill. But tonight, sitting here in the darkness of my empty house with rain drumming against the windows, I finally found the courage to open it. My hands trembled as I lifted the cardboard flaps, releasing the stale smell of his workplace, that mixture of coffee, printer ink, and the faint cologne he wore every morning. The first thing I saw was his coffee mug, the one with the chip on the handle that he refused to throw away, because I'd given it to him for his first day at the job. Seeing it sitting there, still stained with the remnants of his last cup of coffee, nearly broke me again. I had to set it aside and take several deep breaths before I could continue. Underneath were stacks of papers, project reports, and meeting notes covered in his careful handwriting. Even his grocery lists were methodical, organized in neat columns with little check marks next to completed items. I smiled despite myself, remembering how he'd inherited my obsessive need for organization, though he'd always claimed he got it from his father. There were photos, too, pictures of our family vacation last summer, one of him and Sarah at her college graduation, another of him holding our neighbor's new baby with such gentle care that my chest ached remembering it. But it was the notebook at the bottom of the box that stopped me cold. It was nothing special, just a plain black composition book, the kind students use in school. But it was filled entirely with his handwriting, page after page of it, and as I began to read, I realized I was holding something I'd never expected to find. These weren't work notes or random thoughts. These were letters addressed to me. The first entry was dated almost 2 years ago, just a few months after he'd started his job and moved into his own apartment. "Dear Mom," it began, and my vision blurred immediately. "I know you worry about me living alone, about whether I'm eating enough vegetables and remembering to pay my bills on time. I want you to know that every day I think about the things you taught me. When I made breakfast this morning, I could hear your voice reminding me to eat protein with my carbs. When I balanced my checkbook last night, I remembered you sitting with me at the kitchen table showing me how to keep track of every penny. I had to stop reading and wipe my eyes. He'd never told me he was writing these letters. In all our phone calls and visits, he'd never mentioned keeping this notebook. I turned the page and found another entry, dated a few weeks later. Dear Mom, today my co-worker asked me how I learned to be so patient with difficult clients. I told him I learned it from watching you deal with Grandma during her last years. How you never lost your temper, even when she forgot who you were for the third time in one day. I hope someday I can have half your strength. Entry after entry revealed a side of my son I'd never fully understood. He wrote about watching me handle his father's death, about learning resilience from the way I rebuilt our lives afterward. He wrote about small moments I'd completely forgotten. The time I stayed up all night helping him with a science project in 8th grade. The way I always made his favorite cookies when he was stressed about college applications. The morning I drove him to his first job interview and waited in the parking lot just in case he needed me afterward. "Dear Mom," read one entry from last Christmas. "I know you think I'm too busy to visit as much as I should, and you're probably right. But I want you to know that when I'm making decisions about my life, I always ask myself what you would do. Not what you would want me to do, but what you would do if you were in my position. You taught me to think about how my choices affect other people, to work hard even when no one is watching, to be kind even when I don't feel like it, especially when I don't feel like it." I was sobbing now, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere I didn't know existed. But they weren't just tears of grief anymore. Mixed in with the overwhelming sadness was something else, something I hadn't felt since the day he died. A warmth, a sense of connection, a feeling that maybe I hadn't lost him as completely as I'd thought. The entries continued chronologically, and I could see his growth, his struggles, his small victories and everyday disappointments. He wrote about his fears, that he wasn't smart enough for his job, that he'd never find someone to love him the way his father had loved me, that he was disappointing me by not calling more often. But he also wrote about his hopes, his plans for the future, his dreams of traveling to places we'd only seen in pictures together. One entry, dated just 3 months before the accident, made me gasp out loud. "Dear Mom, I've been thinking about starting a family someday, and it scares me because I know I'll never be the parent you were. But then I remember that you were probably scared too, especially after Dad died, and you figured it out as you went along. I think that's what courage really is. Not the absence of fear, but doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. You showed me that every single day." I closed the notebook and held it against my chest, feeling my son's words seeping into the hollow places his death had carved out of me. For months, I'd been convinced that I'd failed him somehow, that there were things I should have said or done differently. I'd replayed every conversation, analyzing every decision, wondering if I'd prepared him well enough for a world that could be so suddenly, brutally unfair. But reading his words, seeing how he'd carried my love and lessons with him into his adult life, I began to understand that maybe I hadn't failed after all. Maybe the gift every parent tries to give their child, the foundation of love and values that helps them navigate life independently, had actually worked. He'd taken everything I'd tried to teach him and made it his own, carried it with him, used it to become the thoughtful, caring, responsible man I'd been so proud of. The notebook had at least 50 more pages of entries, and I knew I'd be reading them slowly, savoring each one like the precious gift they were. But already, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The crushing weight of grief was still there, but it no longer felt like it was suffocating me. For the first time since his death, I could breathe deeply without feeling like my lungs were full of concrete. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. I looked at the coffee mug again, the one with the chip on the handle, and instead of seeing evidence of loss, I saw evidence of love. Love that had lived, love that had mattered, love that had shaped a good man and sent him into the world, carrying the best parts of our family with him. I spent the next several days reading everything Danny had written, not just the notebook I'd found that first night, but a folder on his computer labeled Stories for Mom that I discovered when I finally worked up the courage to turn it on. The password was my birthday. Of course it was. Even in his private digital space, he was thinking of me. The stories were beautiful, raw and honest in a way that made me understand I had raised a young man far wiser than his 24 years should have allowed. He wrote about loneliness and hope, about the weight of other people's expectations, and the freedom found in small acts of rebellion. He wrote about love, not just romantic love, but the love between strangers who help each other on bad days, the love between friends who show up without being asked, the love between a mother and son that survives even death. But it was the emails I found that broke me open in an entirely different way. Hidden in a folder marked Important, Don't Delete, I discovered months of correspondence between Danny and people I'd never heard of. Sarah, a college student in Oregon who was struggling with depression. Marcus, a father in Detroit, who'd lost his job and was sleeping in his car. Elena, a teenage girl in Texas, whose parents had kicked her out for being gay. Dozens of people, maybe hundreds, all connected to my son through something called the Nightlight Project. I sat in his desk chair, the same chair where he'd typed these messages, and read email after email of my son offering hope to strangers. Not with empty platitudes or cheap encouragement, but with real wisdom, practical help, and the kind of presence that makes people feel less alone in the world. Danny, Sarah had written just 2 weeks before the accident. I don't know how you always know exactly what to say, but your last email literally saved my life. I was planning to end everything last Tuesday, but your words about how pain is temporary, but the impact we have on others can be eternal. It stopped me. I'm getting help now. Real help. I wanted you to know that you're the reason I'm still here. Marcus had sent pictures of his new apartment, the first stable housing he'd had in months. The job lead you sent me changed everything, he'd written. But more than that, having someone believe in me when I couldn't believe in myself, that's what really made the difference. You gave me hope, man. I'll never forget that. Eleanor's last message was a photo of her high school graduation. I know you said you wouldn't be able to make it, but I wanted you to see this. First person in my family to graduate. The scholarship information you helped me find made this possible. You saved my life by believing it was worth saving. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through message after message of people whose lives my son had touched. He'd never mentioned any of this to me. Never said a word about staying up late to answer emails from strangers who needed someone to care. Never told me he was spending his own money. Money I knew he didn't have much of, to help people get back on their feet. There was a document on his desktop called Nightlight Manifesto that explained everything. Danny had started the project in college after his roommate attempted suicide. He'd realized that sometimes the difference between someone giving up and someone holding on was as simple as knowing that somewhere in the world, someone cared whether they made it through the night. He'd created anonymous email accounts and social media profiles, reaching out to people who posted about struggling with depression, job loss, family rejection, addiction, grief. He'd spend hours researching resources in their areas, connecting them with local support groups, food banks, LGBTQ+ centers, job placement services. But mostly he just listened and reminded them that their lives had value. The goal isn't to fix everyone, he'd written in his manifesto. It's to be a light in someone's darkness, even if you never see them again. It's to prove that kindness exists and that strangers can care about each other. Some people just need to know they're not completely alone in the world. I thought about all the nights I'd heard him typing after I'd gone to bed. All the times I'd found him at his computer early in the morning, already dressed and ready for work. I'd assumed he was gaming or watching videos or doing whatever young people do on the internet. I'd never imagined he was saving lives. The weight of what I'd discovered settled over me like a warm blanket. My son hadn't just been taken from the world. He'd been actively making it better, one person at a time, in ways no one would ever fully know. He'd been a light in other people's darkness. Just as he'd written, And now he was gone, and all those people were going to wonder why their guardian angel had stopped answering their messages. But then I saw the folder labeled, "For whoever finds this." Inside was a letter addressed to the person reading this, and my heart stopped when I realized it was meant for me. Somehow, Danny had known. He'd known that someday someone would need to understand what he'd been doing, and he'd prepared for that moment. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "it probably means something has happened to me, and you've been going through my things trying to understand who I was and what my life meant. I hope you're not too shocked by what you found. I never talked about the Nightlight Project because I didn't want anyone to think I was showing off or looking for praise. This isn't about being a hero. It's about being human." Tears were streaming down my face as I continued reading. "The people I write to don't know my real name or where I live or what I look like. To them, I'm just someone who cares. But that's the point. In a world where everyone feels isolated and forgotten, sometimes all we need is proof that love still exists, even from strangers, especially from strangers." He'd written instructions for how to continue the project if someone wanted to. Contact information for the people he'd been helping regularly, passwords for the accounts, templates for the kinds of messages that seemed to help most. "I don't expect anyone to take this on," he'd continued. "It's a lot of work, and it can be emotionally draining. But if you're looking for a way to honor my life, this is it. Not flowers or memorials, but continuing to be a light for people who desperately need to believe that light still exists." The letter ended with words that shattered and rebuilt me simultaneously. "Thank you for trying to understand who I was. I love you, whoever you are, and I hope you know that your life has meaning too. We're all just walking each other home." I sat in Danny's chair until the sun was fully up, holding that letter and crying harder than I had since the day of his funeral. But these weren't tears of despair anymore. They were tears of pride, of awe, of overwhelming love for the man my little boy had become when I wasn't looking. He'd left me the greatest gift imaginable, not just the knowledge of who he really was, but a way to carry his love forward into the world. Over the following days, I became an archaeologist of my son's life, carefully excavating each piece of evidence that revealed the person he'd been beyond our dinner table conversations and weekend visits home. I called in sick to work, something I'd never done in 23 years, and devoted myself entirely to understanding the gift Danny had unknowingly prepared for me. The folder labeled Project Hope contained correspondence with dozens of people, each letter meticulously answered in Danny's careful handwriting. There was Maria, a single mother in Denver who'd written about losing her job and facing eviction. Danny had somehow connected her with local resources and even sent her money. Money I now realized came from the part-time job he'd taken for extra spending cash. There was James, a veteran struggling with PTSD, who'd found Danny's blog post about resilience and reached out in desperation. Danny had spent months corresponding with him, eventually helping James connect with both therapy and a support group in his area. But it was the folder marked Dad's Project that brought me to my knees. Inside were printed emails between Danny and someone named Patricia Chen, apparently a literary agent in New York. The earliest email was dated 8 months before Danny's accident, and as I read through them, I realized my son had been working on something extraordinary. He'd been writing a book, not the novel I'd assumed he was pecking away at, but a collection of stories about ordinary people overcoming extraordinary challenges. Stories about resilience, hope, and the quiet heroism of everyday survival. "Danny," Patricia had written in one email, "these stories are absolutely incredible. You have a gift for finding the universal in the specific, for making readers see themselves in situations they've never experienced. The story about your friend Sarah and her battle with anxiety. I had tears in my eyes. And the piece about the elderly man who started learning piano at 75. Pure magic. I really think we have something special here." Danny's response was typically humble. "Thank you, Patricia. I just want people to know they're not alone in their struggles. Everyone has a story worth telling, and everyone deserves to know their pain matters and their healing is possible." I learned that Danny had been donating most of his freelance income to various charities, keeping only enough to cover his basic expenses. I discovered that he'd been volunteering at a crisis hotline every Tuesday night, using the listening skills he'd apparently inherited from his mother, skills I'd never realized I'd passed on to him. I found evidence of a writing workshop he'd been leading at the community center, helping teenagers from difficult backgrounds tell their own stories. Each revelation felt like a small resurrection. The son I thought I'd lost forever was revealing himself to be someone even more extraordinary than I'd imagined. Someone who'd been quietly changing the world one conversation, one letter, one story at a time. But the most devastating discovery came in a manila envelope tucked behind everything else in the box. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to Mom and Dad in Danny's familiar scrawl, along with a legal document I didn't immediately understand. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "then something has happened to me, and I need you to know some things I was too scared to tell you while I was alive." My hands shook as I continued reading. Danny wrote about his depression, the dark periods he'd hidden from us with such skill that we'd never suspected. He wrote about the therapy he'd been attending, the medication that had helped him find stability, and the work he'd been doing to transform his own pain into something that could help others heal. "I know you probably feel guilty," he wrote, "wondering what signs you missed or what you could have done differently. Please don't. You gave me everything I needed to become the person I was meant to be. You taught me that love is action, that family means showing up, and that the most important thing we can do in this world is take care of each other. I just took those lessons and tried to extend them beyond our little circle. The legal document was a will, naming me and his father as beneficiaries of his modest savings account, but also designating that his writing be donated to the community center and that his correspondence with people seeking help be turned over to the crisis hotline where he'd volunteered. He'd wanted his work to continue even if he couldn't. "There's one more thing," the letter continued. "Patricia Chen has been working with me on getting my book published. The advance money, if it ever comes through, I want you to use it to start a foundation. Something small, something local, something that helps people tell their own stories and connect with others who understand their struggles. Call it whatever you want, but I'd like it to be something that reminds people they're not alone." I sat on Danny's bed in our guest room, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived with such intentional kindness that it took my breath away. This wasn't the gift of a perfect son who'd never struggled. This was the gift of a human being who'd taken his own darkness and alchemized it into light for others. The rain had started again, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking at something I couldn't see. But for the first time since that terrible phone call 3 months ago, the sound didn't make me want to scream. Instead, it reminded me that the world was still alive, still moving, still full of creatures who needed tending and stories that needed telling. Danny hadn't just left me memories. He'd left me a mission. I called in sick to work for the rest of the week. I couldn't explain to my supervisor that I needed time to get to know my dead son, that I'd discovered I'd been living with a stranger for 26 years, a stranger who was infinitely more wonderful than I'd ever imagined. How do you tell someone that grief isn't the end of the story when you're just learning that yourself? I spent those days reading every word Danny had written, not just the novel, though I devoured that too, amazed by the richness of his imagination and the wisdom that seemed to flow from every page. But I also read his journals, his letters, even the grocery lists he'd scribbled on the backs of envelopes. I was an archaeologist excavating my son's heart, and every artifact revealed new treasures. There were drafts of stories I'd never known he'd started, characters who felt so real I found myself worried about them When I closed the laptop each night, there were poems that made me understand why he'd sometimes seemed so quiet during family dinners. He hadn't been distant. He'd been listening to the music only he could hear, translating our ordinary moments into something transcendent. But it was the emails that broke me open completely. Hundreds of them. Correspondence with readers who'd found his blog, with other writers who'd sought his advice, with people who'd stumbled across his words during their darkest moments and found exactly what they needed to keep going. Danny had been running a quiet ministry of hope, and I'd never known. One email thread particularly gutted me. A woman named Sarah from Oregon had written to him about her teenage daughter who'd been struggling with depression. She'd found one of Danny's essays about finding purpose in small daily acts of kindness, and something about his words had reached her daughter when nothing else could. The thread spanned 8 months, with Danny gently encouraging both mother and daughter, sharing resources, checking in during the hardest days. Sarah's final email, sent just 2 weeks before Danny died, included a photo of her daughter at her high school graduation. Smiling, radiant, alive. "Your words saved my family," Sarah had written. "I don't know how to thank you for giving me my daughter back." Danny had never mentioned Sarah or her daughter to me. This act of profound grace had been happening right under my roof, and I'd been completely oblivious too, caught up in my own small concerns, to notice that my son was out there catching falling people and setting them back on their feet. I found myself calling his phone number just to hear his voice on the voicemail. "Hey, you've reached Danny. I'm probably writing or walking somewhere thinking about writing. Leave me a message and I'll get back to you soon." That casual confidence, that assumption that there would always be time to get back to people, to honor their trust in him with his attention. It made my chest ache with a different kind of grief, not just for what I'd lost, but for what the world had lost. On Thursday afternoon, I finally worked up the courage to email Sarah in Oregon. I introduced myself as Danny's mother and told her what had happened. I thanked her for helping me understand who my son really was. I asked her to tell me more about her daughter, about how Danny's words had made a difference in their lives. Her response came within an hour, and I sobbed as I read it. She told me about the specific essay that had reached her daughter, about how Danny's description of depression as weather that passes through the soul had helped a 16-year-old girl understand that her pain was temporary, manageable, survivable. She told me about the book recommendations he'd sent, the gentle check-ins during exam weeks, the way he'd celebrated small victories with them, as if they were his own family. "Your son had a gift for making people feel seen," Sarah wrote. "He made my daughter believe she was worth saving, and then he gave her the tools to save herself. I know this is an impossible time for you, but please know that Danny's love is still working in the world. My daughter starts college in the fall. She wants to study psychology, to help other kids the way Danny helped her. His kindness is multiplying, creating more kindness. That's his legacy." I printed that email and taped it to Danny's computer monitor. Then I sat back in his chair and looked around his room with new eyes. This wasn't a shrine to my grief anymore. It was mission control for an ongoing operation of hope. The writing wasn't just Danny's hobby or his dream. It was his calling, his contribution to the world's healing. And somehow, impossibly, it was still happening. That night, I called my sister Lisa for the first time since the funeral. She'd been texting regularly, offering to come stay with me, to help me sort through Danny's things, to just sit with me in the silence. I'd ignored every message, too buried in my own pain to let anyone else in. But now I needed to tell someone what I'd discovered. He was helping people, I told her, my voice shaking with wonder instead of despair for the first time in months. "Lisa, our Danny was out there catching people who were falling, and he never said a word about it. He was this quiet hero, and I had no idea." Lisa cried with me, and then she said something that changed everything. "What are you going to do with his writing? It sounds like the world needs to read it." I hadn't thought that far ahead, I'd been so focused on understanding what I'd found that I hadn't considered the responsibility that came with it. But as soon as she asked the question, I knew the answer with perfect clarity. Danny had left me more than memories and more than insight into who he'd been. He'd left me work to do. The first thing I did was contact Dr. Martinez, the professor whose letter had been tucked between the pages of Danny's manuscript. When I called the university and asked to speak with him, explaining who I was, there was a long pause before he asked if he could drive down to see me, instead of talking on the phone. He arrived the next evening, a small man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle way of speaking that reminded me instantly of Danny. We sat in my living room with coffee growing cold between us while he told me about my son, not the boy I'd raised, but the young man he'd become. He came to my office hours every week, Dr. Martinez said, his hands wrapped around his mug. Not because he was struggling with the coursework. Danny was brilliant, one of the finest writers I've taught in 30 years. He came because he wanted to talk about purpose, about how to use words to help people heal. He told me about Danny's senior thesis, a collection of stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, about how Danny would stay after class to talk with classmates who were struggling, not with their writing, but with life itself, about the quiet way he'd shared his own experiences with loss. He'd written about his grandfather's death, about watching me grieve, about learning that love doesn't end when someone dies. I kept one of his assignments, Dr. Martinez said, reaching into his briefcase. I hope you don't mind. I've never kept a student's work before, but this piece, it changed how I think about teaching, about why we tell stories at all. The essay was titled, Letters to the Living. In it, Danny had written about finding his grandfather's journal after the funeral, filled with entries addressed to family members he'd never see grow up. Danny had written about the power of leaving words behind, of how the dead continue to speak to us, long after their voices have gone silent. Reading his words, I could hear his voice so clearly it made my chest ache. But it was a different kind of ache than the hollow pain I'd been carrying. This felt full instead of empty, warm instead of cold. This felt like love instead of loss. He talked about you often, Dr. Martinez continued, about how strong you were, how you taught him that grief was just love with nowhere to go. He was working on something special in those last months, something he wanted to surprise you with. My hands were shaking as I looked up from the essay, the manuscript. More than that, Dr. Martinez smiled sadly. He was putting together a proposal for a non-profit organization, a writing program for people dealing with loss, grief counseling through storytelling. He'd already reached out to several hospitals and counseling centers. He wanted to call it Words for the Wounded. The room felt like it was spinning. I set down the coffee mug with trembling hands and tried to process what he was telling me. Danny hadn't just been writing stories. He'd been building something, creating a way to turn his own experience with loss into healing for others. He had it all planned out, Dr. Martinez continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase. The curriculum, the training materials, even a list of potential volunteers. He'd been working on it for over a year, I think. I think he was going to tell you about it when he graduated. The folder was thick, filled with Danny's careful handwriting and typed pages. As I flipped through it, I saw grant applications he'd started, letters to potential partners, a detailed outline for workshops that would help people process their grief through creative writing. There were testimonials from the students he'd already helped informally, stories of how his gentle guidance had helped them find their voices in the midst of their pain. At the very back of the folder was a letter addressed to me. My name was written on the envelope in Danny's familiar scrawl, and underneath it, in smaller letters, for when you're ready to help others heal the way you helped me. I couldn't open it. Not yet, but holding it in my hands, feeling the weight of his words waiting inside, I understood something that had been eluding me for months. Danny's death wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of mine. Dr. Martinez stayed for another hour, sharing memories and looking through the manuscript together. Before he left, he handed me his business card and wrote his personal number on the back. "If you decide to move forward with his program," he said, "I'd like to help. I think Danny was onto something important, something that could help a lot of people, and I think he'd want his mother to be the one to make it happen." After he left, I sat alone with Danny's folder spread across my coffee table. The house was quiet except for the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator. But the silence didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt expectant, like the pause between asking a question and receiving an answer. I thought about all the people who had written to Danny, all the lives he'd touched with his words and his presence. I thought about his grandfather's journal, about the letters to the living that had inspired Danny's essay. I thought about the gift he'd left me, not just his writing, but his vision, his passion, his unfinished work. And for the first time since that terrible phone call, I felt something besides grief stirring in my chest. It was purpose. It was hope. It was the beginning of understanding that losing Danny hadn't broken me after all. It had prepared me for the most important work of my life. 6 months later, I stood in a bookstore watching a woman with tears streaming down her face clutch a copy of Letters to the Living to her chest. It was Danny's book, our book now, and this was the launch event I'd dreamed about but never thought I'd be brave enough to organize. The publisher had been hesitant at first. "Posthumous debuts are tricky," the editor had explained gently. "The market is difficult." But when I'd shown her Danny's manuscript, when I'd shared some of the letters from people he'd helped, when I'd told her about Marcus and Eleanor and the dozens of others who'd reached out after I'd started the website, everything changed. "This isn't just a book," she'd said finally. "This is a movement." The woman with the tears approached me hesitantly. "Are you Danny's mother?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When I nodded, she took my hands in hers. "I'm Jennifer. I wrote to your son 2 years ago when I was planning to end my life. I'd lost my husband, my job, everything that mattered to me. But Danny," he wrote back, "not just once, but for months. He helped me see that my story wasn't over, that there were still chapters left to write. I'd heard variations of this story dozens of times now, but it never stopped taking my breath away." Jennifer continued, "I wanted you to know that I'm a teacher now. I work with at-risk kids, and I tell them what Danny told me, that their pain doesn't define them, that their story isn't over. I've probably shared his words with hundreds of students over the past 2 years." She squeezed my hands tighter. "He's still saving lives, you know, through his writing, through you, through all of us who carry his message forward." Later that evening, after the bookstore had emptied and the last reader had shared their story, I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Sarah. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "It was beautiful," I said, and meant it. Danny would have been amazed to see how many people came, how many lives his words have touched. I watched the bookstore employees through the window, moving around the remaining stacks of Danny's book. I keep thinking about that night when I opened his desk drawer, when I thought I was looking for something to help me understand why he was gone. But that wasn't what I found at all. "What did you find?" I'd been asked this question in interviews, at readings, by other grieving parents who'd heard about Danny's story. But tonight, after watching strangers become friends over shared copies of my son's words, after seeing Jennifer's tears transform into hope, I finally had the perfect answer. "I found out that he never left," I said. "Death took his body, but it couldn't touch what he'd built, the connections, the healing, the love he'd scattered into the world like seeds. When I discovered his writing, when I reached out to the people he'd helped, when I made the decision to publish his book, I wasn't just preserving his memory. I was tending his garden." The metaphor felt right in a way that made my chest tight with both grief and joy. Danny had always loved gardens. Even as a little boy, he'd insisted on helping me plant our vegetables each spring. his small hands careful with the delicate seedlings. He'd understood even then that growth required patience, that beauty came from nurturing, that the most important work happened beneath the surface where no one could see. He left me broken, I continued, my voice steady despite the tears I could feel starting, completely shattered. But breaks aren't always endings, are they? Sometimes they're openings. Sometimes they're the cracks that let the light in. I thought about the foundation I was starting, funded by the book's proceeds, the scholarship program for young writers who wanted to use their words for healing, the workshop series for people learning to write through grief, the mentorship program that would pair experienced letter writers with those just beginning to reach out into the darkness, looking for connection. Danny's gift wasn't just his writing, I said, the understanding crystallizing as I spoke. It was showing me that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. It becomes action, becomes service, becomes the choice to turn your pain into purpose. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. He broke me open so I could become someone big enough to carry his work forward. That night, I came home to a house that no longer felt empty. The same walls, the same furniture, the same framed photos of my boy at every age. But the quality of silence had changed. It wasn't the hollow silence of absence anymore. It was the rich, full silence of a life being lived with intention, of work being done that mattered, of love finding new ways to express itself in the world. I walked into Danny's room, which I'd finally been able to enter again after finding his writings. His desk was clean now, organized with copies of letters from his readers, thank you notes from workshop participants, and the business cards of publishers who wanted to discuss future projects. On his bookshelf sat the first copy of Letters to the Living that had rolled off the press, inscribed not with an author's signature, but with my own words, for Danny, who taught me that the most powerful stories are the ones we write together. Before bed, I did what had become my new ritual. I sat at his desk and opened my laptop to the email account we'd created for the foundation. There were always messages waiting, from people who'd read Danny's book, from workshop graduates who wanted to share their progress, from other parents who'd lost children and were looking for ways to honor their memory through service. Tonight there was a message from Marcus, Danny's first pen pal, who'd become one of the Foundation's most dedicated volunteers. I wanted you to know, he wrote, that I just finished training my 10th mentee, a young man who lost his sister in a car accident and couldn't see a way forward. Today he told me he's ready to start writing to other people who are grieving. Danny's circle keeps growing, and it's beautiful to watch. I smiled as I typed my response, my fingers moving with the confidence that had grown from months of this work. Each email was a seed, each workshop was a garden, each connection was proof that love finds a way to multiply itself across the boundaries of life and death. Losing my son had broken me, yes, but in discovering the gift he'd left behind, not just his words, but his example, his mission, his invitation to turn suffering into service, I'd learned that being broken wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of becoming someone I'd never imagined I could be. Someone who could hold both grief and joy, both loss and purpose, both the terrible absence of my child and the magnificent presence of his continuing impact on the world. Someone who understood that the deepest gift any of us can leave behind isn't what we take with us when we go, but what we plant in the hearts of others while we're here. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I whispered the words that had become my evening prayer. Thank you, Danny, for showing me that love never really ends. It just learns how to bloom in new soil. And in the darkness of my no longer empty house, I could swear I felt him smiling,